Policing TV. I'm at the De Vere Grand Connaught Rooms in central London for the Operation Talla National Awards. Operation Talla was the pan-UK policing operation set up in March 2020 to deal with the pandemic. Now, I'm going to be talking to some of the winners of the awards, but first of all, let's hear from the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and the Chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, Martin Hewitt.
When the pandemic happened, it required immediate action and coordination, as you all know, in individual forces and organisations, but also by policing at the centre. And it was at every level of the organisation, from chief officers, all other officers, all staff. And Talla, as we named it at the very beginning, quickly became a household name for all of us. And the challenge was for policing to step up to the task. And we work really closely with government and other partners. And really what we're celebrating today is our national response to what was a national crisis. It's about commemorating the really remarkable work that many of you in this room led and shaped, and it's across every activity that you can think of that would link into policing. And one thing I will say, because we've got a number of teams that are recognised, and obviously we couldn't fit everyone into this, and some of the teams were absolutely huge. So please remember where we are. We're also sending our thanks to all those other members of the teams that can't be here today and we couldn't accommodate into the event. And I also want to recognise all those that contributed to the national response, because there's lots of people that have already received thanks in their individual force. And it was a bringing together of all of our activity and people that just quietly got on with their jobs wherever they were, regardless of the fact the way the pandemic was affecting. And we should recognise all of those people as well. And when we started, and Paul Netherton, who's here somewhere, and I were having a chat earlier about the moment where we decided, or I sort of decided, we need to do this in a national way. Paul was our lead for crisis management and issues like that, and Paul had been leading as the whole thing was building up. And we got to a point in sort of mid-Feb where it became fairly apparent this was going to be so much bigger than just talking about resilience. It was going to affect everything around policing. And I asked Paul to come up to the office in Victoria Street, and we sat there and decided we need to create this operation, and then grabbed Owen from upstairs to pull that together. And what were we aiming to achieve? The first thing, of course, was it was about preserving life, and it was about maintaining law and order, and it was still going to be about preventing crime. Whatever path the pandemic took, it was always going to be about that. It was also about how we maintained our core service during a period of uncertainty. There are other parts and other sectors who effectively closed down on day one of the pandemic, and we didn't. Our objective all the time was, how do we keep everything going, and then we gradually peel back when we need to peel back. And if you think back to those times, it seems like a while ago, but we were having conversations where we were talking about, what if we have 40% of our staff off sick or unavailable at work? And we never got anywhere near that, as you all know. So it was all about how do we keep it going. And of course, it was about assisting our colleagues, particularly in the NHS. Because throughout all of this has been a health crisis. It's not been a policing crisis. It's been a health crisis where we helped. But what we also set out, and one of my biggest points of all of it, because you could start to see, we were looking at what happened in Europe, and you could start to see the way policing was going to have to operate. And the biggest point was, we want to come out of the other side of this with either at least as good a relationship with the public, or even if we could, a better relationship with the public, because we knew this was going to get us into a place. It's almost impossible to think back that there was a point where it was illegal to be outside your house. And we were moving around to try and look at that. So we wanted to do that, and we came up with the 4 E's that Alfie had just referred to, and it was so important. And I think that was the one biggest thing that the best decision we took early on, was this was going to be about engaging with people in the way that we always engage with people. It was going to be about explaining, because it was complicated. We thought it was going to be complicated. It turned out to be a lot more complicated than we thought it was going to be at the beginning. Trying to explain to people and then encouraging them to do what they needed to do to keep everyone safe. and then only as a last resort, obviously, getting involved in enforcement. And I think we achieved that aim, and it's really interesting. And we've been having all sorts of conversations about trust and confidence in policing for all the reasons you would understand. But one thing that makes me feel really pleased about what we did during COVID was no one talks about COVID as being a factor. It's not about the way you dealt with us during the pandemic, and I think we should be really proud about that. So there is a strong determination to rebuild that trust, as you know, engaging ever more with communities, listening to people's concerns, and we've got a strong foundation to build on that. We've always dealt with critical incidents in policing. That is what we do, and quite honestly, it's what we quite enjoy as well. But I think this was different for 4 reasons to anything else, certainly that I'd ever been involved in. The first thing was, it affected literally every square metre of the United Kingdom was affected by the pandemic. If you think about floods or you think about foot and mouth, it will be in a relatively contained space. Second thing was we had no idea when it was going to end. Again, if you think about floods in this country, worst case scenario, 3 weeks later, the rain's going to stop a bit. It's still horrible, it's still messy, but you're not in the middle of that. We had no idea how long this was going to last, and there was nowhere really we could look to get that answer. The other one, which particularly from the role that I was playing and others, was I've never been involved in any other critical incident where every single government department is engaged in the process. And some of those meetings that I was in where decisions were being made about the restrictions and the regulations, and you would end up with a regulation, and then here are the 37 exceptions to the regulation, and you'd be talking about not letting people into the country, and DCMS would put their hand up and say, but we've got to let the Formula One teams in for the Grand Prix at Silverstone, or Real Madrid have got to turn up to play a football match, and then bays would come in about business and keeping business going. And that kind of balance all the time between health, protecting people, and the economy and keeping life going. There's no other, I think, any other example where we've been in quite the same. And then the last one is, in every other critical incident I've dealt with, and I'm sure all of you, you go to work, you are a police officer, you're a police staff, you're a firefighter, whatever you are, you do your professional thing and then you go away, and then you go back and do your professional thing again. In this instance, all of us were personally affected all the time. We were all worried about our own families, our elderly relatives, our people that we were caring for. So that, again, I think, placed a really different factor on it. And that meant that all of us and all of our colleagues were taking that pressure home every day. For those that did go home, because there were plenty of people who chose not to go home, they went out and did what they did, but they didn't go home because they didn't want to risk other people. The pandemic was a unique moment, and we all hope that we won't have to experience anything like it again, but I think the service is in a much better place to be prepared to deal with anything of that like if it comes. And that is in large part thanks to the work of all you people here that are here to be commended today, and from the lessons that we've learnt. And the entire service, I think, deserves everybody's thanks for what we achieved. And this today will be an impressive set of skills spanning across just about everything you could think about from policing and across the whole of the UK, which all stuck together and supported that national response. And one of the other things that I was really proud of in policing is that we took the decision through Talla that we were going to police this as one UK police force. And for most of the pandemic, you had different laws in the 4 countries, and yet policing, we all worked together and we all got on and did what we had to do to manage that. And I think that was absolutely excellent. Do you remember the point where it was 2 metres distance for this, that and the other? And I always remember one of the phrases that it was Olivia Pinckney, who's the chief in Hampshire, and Olivia came out with the phrase and said, yeah, but people just got to understand you can't police at 2 metres distance, and we have to get hands-on with people, and that's what all of our folks were doing day in, day out. And we had the opportunity, and with the support of the Minister and the Home Secretary, we had the opportunity to go and make that known to government as broader, difficult decisions were being made. And I think what it also showed us is that this model of coordinating from the centre and what we're really capable when we as a service come together really quickly around some of this stuff as well. Things that did not exist on a Friday existed on a Monday. And that is really remarkable, and that's what we're going to talk about. And that sort of positive, pragmatic and collaborative approach, both with ministers but also with officials as well, and we got people here from the Home Office, and we pretty much became, some of Owen's teams became pretty much joined with teams in the Home Office throughout that period, and that was really important to help us get through the pandemic, but it also helps us as we carry on doing all the other things we do. Those relationships and that trust and that ability to challenge one another is really important. But finally, it is important that we acknowledge the role of the entire service again, and there'll be thousands of people who gave their best and went above and beyond, and we won't get the chance to recognise them today. And of course, that colossal national effort was not, sadly, without tragic loss, and ourselves as the service did lose valued officers and staff to the pandemic and in the course of the pandemic. And each force remembers their contribution, their diligence and their professionalism, and we owe a sincere thanks and recognition to those individuals.
And from my perspective, I've been Home Secretary now for almost 3 years. It feels much longer than that for reasons that I don't need to go into this afternoon. But I think there is a very clear reflection, and this afternoon's events will speak to this, that quite frankly, our country and our society could not have functioned without the skills, professionalism and the dedication that you collectively all brought together during the pandemic. And as Martin and Owen have said, I mean, that central and national coordination was like no other. It had not happened before, but it very much spoke to the scale of the challenges that we found ourselves seeking to address, but also the fact that you can't do these things on your own. We have to support each other. And indeed, I have seen day in, day out, the extent of your responsibilities. That's just on regular policing duties. But that alongside the pandemic was really quite extraordinary. And one of the things that I never tire from saying, I know that many colleagues in the room that I've been working with over recent years have heard me say many times, is that yes, your responsibilities are absolutely vast. And our responsibilities from government as Home Secretary, the Police Minister, Kit Malthouse is here today as well, we know is to back you and support you through some very, very difficult and challenging times and moments. But I never tire from saying that if you look beyond the badges and the uniforms and everything else, we must all remember that you are all people. You are human beings too. And with that, as Martin said earlier on, you still have families, homes, all sorts of day-to-day things that you still have to juggle and deal with. But I've always said, policing, yes, it's full of ordinary people, but people who are, quite frankly, extraordinary for so many reasons and do extraordinary things. So if I can just make a few remarks, actually, around Operation Talla, which, quite frankly, has been probably the greatest coming together of all aspects of policing as part of what was a national endeavour to keep our country and our people safe. And it was an endeavour like no other. I pray that we will never have to do anything of that nature again, but as Owen has said, COVID is on the rise again. But when we think about the learnings of this recent years and the experiences that we've had, we know that we're ready, and we know that we can be one team and work together to absolutely do the right thing. And you've just heard, actually, about sort of the coming together, the ways of working, the frequency that Martin and I were speaking. We had our moments, there's no doubt about it, because it was a Herculean effort nationally. There's no doubt about that in terms of coming together across national policing. And I don't think I'll ever forget the way in which, I was supported as Home Secretary, but actually Kit, myself, government ministers and colleagues too across government by policing, helping to make the right decisions, helping to make the right choices so that we could empower and support you all day in, day out. But also the way in which we pulled together. And we know policing is difficult. And in fact, the 4 E's, the famous 4 E's, which we would speak about day in, day out, were absolutely pivotal to bring in the public closer to policing, but also giving the public a sense of trust and confidence in policing, which was absolutely vital. Now, I really don't want to re-traumatise Martin and Owen too much, but when I do look back and recall on the late-night meetings, the late-night phone calls, the emails and everything else, those discussions, the famous regulations, I think it's fair to say, I think Martin and I probably spoke quite often at 11 o'clock at night, expecting regulations to be signed by a health minister at midnight, believe it or not. out. And more often than not, us collectively, so MPCC, MPOC, Home Office officials, my colleagues are in the here today as well, getting regulations and guidance drafted for the teams that were going to work literally the following day. It was never perfect. We'll never say that it was perfect. Of course, we won't say that. But there were days when obviously shifts were coming on in the morning and the regulations were being printed, literally, because they've just been signed off. So I do actually want to give my thanks to everyone, because we came together as a team, and I maintained this, and I've always said this, we are a team. And that support is absolutely crucial. I noticed Martin airbrushed out those infamous press conferences where Martin and I were literally put under the spotlight on Saturday afternoons, if I recall rightly, Martin. That used to be the slot that we were given, to do the explanations, the 4 E's in particular, while reiterating the health reasons as to why policing, and we had asked as a government, policing to do the most unprecedented things. So we look back, actually, I think with a great deal of pride, recognition, and distinction in terms of the service that everyone gave. And if I may, these awards speak very much to that, across the board, not just for people in policing in uniforms, but also to the staff in teams, the people that were there doing the call handling, the people that were there in the ops room, recognising that we were facing very, very difficult challenges throughout all of that. But if I may, there is also the whole aspect of policing and welfare. And there are many, many discussions, and rightly so, about police officer welfare throughout that time. And I think it's actually worth reflecting upon the fact that, you know, when we think about the pandemic itself, everyone just assumes, well, there wasn't much going on, you know, government was just focused on the pandemic. Yes, we were. But actually, I know the policing minister will testify to this. We were still legislating, we were still reforming, we were still bringing in all the hard work, the 9 yards, in terms of bringing in legislation around police protection, for example, the police covenant, but also strengthening our laws, putting more resourcing into policing, because that was the right thing to do. And although the pandemic feels like a long time ago, and for those of us that deliver legislation on the floor of the Parliament, which during that time was virtual Parliament as well, it wasn't the full thing that you see right now, we were legislating to bring the police covenant in, we were legislating to ensure that we had the right and tougher sentences for, quite frankly, members of the public that were abusing police officers, spitting at police officers and doing the most appalling things. And we have always been very vocal and spoken out about that, and we will still stand by that as well, because we wanted to recognise and do much more to appreciate and recognise the physical, mental, psychological hardships that policing faces day in, day out. And I think you'll be hearing from Andy Rhodes later on as well, and it was actually Andy throughout the pandemic, but also through the development of the police covenant as well, that crucially has helped us and supported us to very much address some of these big issues and also learn from the lessons of the pandemic, which is absolutely crucial in terms of protection. Now, I'm pleased to say, I really am, and I speak with great humility about today's events and the awards, primarily because this is a recognition, it's a celebration. We don't use the word celebration much around the pandemic because it has scarred our country, it has scarred the world, but has scarred the lives of so many, particularly those who lost loved ones. But actually, during my time as Home Secretary, I've witnessed many events. Most of them are shocking because of the nature of the work that we're involved in. And I also work with many teams within the Home Office. But I have to say, we did throughout the pandemic establish a new emergency response team, which provides that 24/7 response, alongside working with central coordination, national coordination. And it's headed up by our colleague, who is also here today, Neil Patterson, who you will also hear from as well, and get to meet hopefully later on. These are the relationships that matter. I don't think they've existed before in terms of government and policing, and that is how we must absolutely ensure that these partnerships continue, so that when we are challenged and confronted by threats, insecurity, instability, because let's not forget, even during the pandemic, many of you were on the front line, policing protests and public order. All of that seems to have been forgotten. Public order protests now are somewhat different. As we now know, we were able to absolutely support one another there as well. So finally, I just want to reflect actually on the video that we've just seen. The sacrifice that has been made by colleagues who are no longer with us, recognising the huge sacrifice but also the contribution that they have given. They will never be forgotten, and we will always honour, respect and treasure them. But also in terms of the nominees for today's awards, I think you will just be exhilarated by the stories, maybe shocked as well. I mean, we still remember trying to commission PPE, which became a national effort, of course. But policing absolutely stood up and delivered for the British public. And I just want to really just end by saying we are one team. I never tire of saying that. And it's the way in which we support each other, the way in which we work together, the leadership that we can give as well, which actually helps to grow resilience, professionalism, but also deliver for the public. That's what policing is about. And, you know, if I may say so, an enormous thank you, not just from me personally, but also from Kit, but actually from the whole of government for your service, your contribution, and for everything that you do. Thanks very much.
After the speeches, the winners were presented with their awards. We caught up with some of them to ask them about their efforts during the pandemic.
My real role at the time, I was a PA, and I'd just finished a secondment to ISAVAR, which was the NATO conference in Hertfordshire, and I'd been a business manager in that. Went back to the role as a PA, and then within a week, COVID happened. So I was approached by one of the exec to say, you know, you've just come back, but would you help set up? We don't know what it looks like, we don't know how long it's going to be, but will you help set it up? And yeah, I jumped at the chance. We had lots of meetings, so being a PA, it was natural for me to take minutes, to take notes. So that's how it started, and then the role developed. So I started getting involved in helping organise PPE, short notice vaccinations when the vaccinations come out. So the local trust, at the end of the day, we're going to get rid of their vaccinations, but we had an agreement with them, so I helped set up a process where they're during our force control room to say we got 10, 11, 12, whatever vaccinations, and we tried to narrow it down to those who were most vulnerable, who we knew of, to try and get them there, to get them vaccinated. And then all the sickness, if we had anyone reported sick, was reported into in the central email account. I'd monitor that, I'd look after that, I'd check on their welfare, and then also look for spikes and things like that. So try and look internally if there was like a higher number somewhere, maybe on the team, and then look at getting that area specially cleaned or offering advice. And then on top of that was also learning, as the guidance was all coming through, how it was all changing and how it would impact on everyone. And, you know, I never thought I'd learn so much about COVID, but yeah, I did.
So I'm Chief Superintendent Howard Hodges. I'm from Sussex Police. But during COVID, I was seconded into the National Police Coordination Centre and an integral part of Talla. I joined when COVID was a thing on the news, started my secondment, and actually that was all supposed to be about mutual aid, about capacity and capability of policing across the country, resourcing events, operations. But it became very obvious that COVID was becoming a significant thing, and then effectively myself and the majority of the team were repurposed, and Talla became our primary focus.
So what was your specific role?
So my primary role was looking at resourcing and capability, so actually making sure and reporting into both policing and into government, giving reassurance that actually we had the right number of people who were still able to go and deliver some of the core functions, but also business as usual. Because of course at some points at the very start we were concerned we might have 40, 50, potentially 60% of our staff not able to attend work, and of course the public still needed us to be able to respond.
Well, right at the beginning, got called to a gold meeting to say, can you advise on COVID tactically from a medical perspective? Obviously at the beginning there was no medical evidence. It was unprecedented for a person in my position as a nurse. I've never not had medical evidence for a condition or a disease, or there's always a treatment, and so it was the first time I had to go away and think about it. I couldn't offer immediate advice, and it was a bit scary actually. So we identified our clinically extremely vulnerable people and then our clinically vulnerable people, and then those who had, you know, very vulnerable children in their families or very elderly parents, and then we worked out who was okay to go on the front line. And I worked within a team called Op Restore and Op Renew. We had a silver commander there who, you know, oversaw everything, but it was a lot. And then we had to keep reviewing. So we did a risk assessment for all these people, and then they were reviewed as the guidance was updated, which was often. Beginning, obviously, when everything went into lockdown, I was at home in my cottage working. I mean, luckily we got Teams quite quickly, so we were able to connect online with the teams, and I was able to give patients a bit of comfort because we had the cameras, which made a big difference, you know, because you could talk to people and reassure them. I know it's not the same as in person, but at least you can give some eye contact and hopefully give them the right medical advice.
During the pandemic, I've been involved both regionally and nationally with the preparation of business continuity, planning around the potential threats to the force and forces nationally, and feeding that information in to the National Police Chiefs Council Op Talla Silver meetings, and equally being part of those meetings has allowed me to pick up information and quickly pass that on to colleagues up and down the country. Business continuity focuses on the police service's critical functions. So there are 43 forces. Each force has determined what their critical functions are, and importantly, what resources are required to provide that function continuously without losing the ability to provide them. There are business continuity plans in place that detail what those functions are and what the resources are that are required to continuously provide them. So, obviously with the pandemic, a serious threat to those critical functions was the inability to provide them due to loss of staff. And throughout COVID, there have been periods where that has looked particularly vulnerable. So what my job is, and colleagues, business continuity manager colleagues up and down the country, is to, first of all, where threat is recognised, to ensure that the plans are robust within every force, and importantly, colleagues in every force are aware of the threat and risk. And what we can do, and what we did do, was develop tabletop exercises around those vulnerabilities and present to plan owners scenarios around 10, 30 and 50% reduction in staff before the pandemic actually got to that level. So what that meant was, when it happened, and it did, plan owners had already, well, they were basically on the front foot in terms of the outcomes of that, and had been able to put robust plans, update and review plans to make sure that they could meet the demand, if you like, of what was coming.
Yeah, so I'm Carl Morgan. I'm an inspector in South Wales Police, and I was the operational commander for our response to COVID. I remember very vividly, it was in January, so our day job was emergency planning, business continuity. So myself and the Chief Inspector saw the news breaking in Wuhan, so we knew something was coming, didn't know how quick and how big it was going to be. So even though it was a health emergency and we were working with our partners, it was clearly a big part to play for policing. So it's been a very busy 2 years. Again, I've commuted today really on my own, but should be with quite a big team that we had assembled. A lot of moving parts that we put into play. So from the basis of emergency planning, we were quite able to sort of quickly kick off standard operating procedures and policies, put them into play with a command architecture and a command room, and then very quickly then how we put into play different elements like PPE, how do we source that, which then grew into being sort of innovative. So even though we had the social distancing and working from home, how do we get the protective screens, how do we do lateral flow testing, we created a sudden death response vehicle as well, how we fit people with masks, so you have to wear like an FFP3 mask. So again, every day was a challenge, and that's how we sort of rose and responded to that challenge.
Were there any moments when you sort of put your head in your hands and thought, oh, that's better how we do this?
Yeah, every day and probably every Friday, because you knew by Monday there'd be, especially in Wales, as a devolved administration, so there was a national picture, but then how would that work locally for South Wales and Pan Wales. So it was a very fast-moving sort of piece of work. Normally that was a legal team, so they worked sort of long hours to try and get that legislation over the line with briefing documents, because when the sun rose the next day, the new teams are going to have to put that into play. So briefing was key, and how we got that delivered to the supervisors for their briefings. It was a hard 2 years in work, but with the team that we had a laugh every single day. You know, even doing some like competitions, probably a few things we can't talk about. But yeah, it was a very interesting time. I can say with the team it was very enjoyable, but on the other side then we know people are sort of suffering a lot of harm, a lot of sort of anxiety and depression, so it was hard to sort of balance the both, but I think we just made the most of the emergency, got on with the job and pride in what we did and how we did it. So in a funny way, we probably enjoyed ourselves for 2 years.
Because you had a sense of mission, a sense of purpose.
Yeah, a sense of achievement with the team together as a collective. You know, like I said, I've committed there on my own. There's a team behind me of 33 people, all doing different functions, which we call the COVID cogs. So they should be rewarded on their own as well for the work that they did and their dedication, putting their bodies on the line and doing work. You know, before the vaccine was born, so they knew the dangers, but you know they still cracked on and volunteered, which was fantastic.